Hi, how are you? As a person who has devoted his career to protecting and promoting free speech and essentially made it my life's work, I would say at this point, I wanted to comment on the interviews that were done with three university presidents last week in the United States Congress, namely Claudine Gay from Harvard, Liz Magill from the University of Pennsylvania, and Sally Kornbluth from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, it's important to point out that FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, publishes an annual ranking of free speech viability on 248 different college and university campuses. On that list, Harvard scored dead last, 248th place. They were the only institution to receive a characterization of abysmal. They received a score of 0 out of 100. The University of Pennsylvania was right behind them, ranked 247th. Their characterization was very poor, and their score was 11.13 out of 100. Surprisingly, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology scored 136. They received a characterization of average, and their score was 45.13 out of 100. Now, I will say, to be ranked 136th and receive a score of average, that is really based on the context of all of the other colleges and universities that you are being rated against. The very idea that you could be rated 136th in the United States on free speech and receive a characterization of average is also very telling. Now, it's important to point out that this is not just an opinion or the attitude of the editors at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. There are a number of metrics and very measurable criteria that go into assessing these 248 different institutions. I'll put a link in the description below so you can see that yourself. The point is, this is a very scientific process. It's not just them putting their general broad opinions based on YouTube videos and media that they've absorbed, okay? So this is a scientific study in every sense of the term. Now, let's take a look at some of the footage that was taken last week, primarily the questioning of Representative from New York, Elise Stefanik.
Dr. Kornbluth,
Yes.
At MIT, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate MIT's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
If targeted at individuals, not making public statements.
Yes or no? Calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment?
I have not heard calling for the genocide for Jews on our campus.
But you've heard chants for intifada.
I've heard chants, which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context, when calling for the elimination of the Jewish people.
So those would not be according to the MIT's code of conduct or rules?
That would be investigated as harassment if pervasive and severe.
Ms. Magill, at Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
I am asking specifically calling for the genocide of Jews. Does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context. That is not bullying or harassment. This is the easiest question to answer yes, Ms. Magill. So is your testimony that you will not answer yes?
If the
yes or no?
If the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide? The speech is not harassment? This is unacceptable, Ms. Magill. I'm going to give you one more opportunity for the world to see your answer. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct when it comes to bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be harassment.
The answer is yes. And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context?
Targeted as an individual, at an individual.
It's targeted at Jewish students, Jewish individuals. Do you understand your testimony is dehumanizing them? Do you understand that dehumanization is part of anti-Semitism? I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board. Dr. Gay, a Harvard student calling for the mass murder of African Americans is not protected free speech at Harvard, correct?
Our commitment to free speech...
It's a yes or no question. Is that corrected? Is that okay for students to call for the mass murder of African Americans at Harvard? Is that protected free speech?
Our commitment to free speech...
It's a yes or no question. Let me ask you this. You are president of Harvard, so I assume you're familiar with the term intifada, correct?
I've heard that term, yes.
And you understand that the use of the term intifada in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict is indeed a call for violent armed resistance against the state of Israel, including violence against civilians and the genocide of Jews. Are you aware of that?
That type of hateful speech is personally abhorrent to me.
And there have been multiple marches at Harvard with students chanting, quote, "There is only one solution, intifada revolution," and, quote, "globalize the intifada." Is that correct?
I've heard that thoughtless, reckless, and hateful language on our campus, yes.
So based upon your testimony, you understand that this call for intifada is to commit genocide against the Jewish people in Israel and globally, correct?
I will say again, that type of hateful speech is personally abhorrent to me.
Do you believe that type of hateful speech is contrary to Harvard's Code of Conduct, or is it allowed at Harvard?
It is at odds with the values of Harvard.
Can you not say here that it is against the Code of Conduct at Harvard?
We embrace a commitment to free expression, even of views that are objectionable, offensive, hateful. It's when that speech crosses into conduct that violates our policies against bullying, harassment,
Does that speech not cross that barrier? Does that speech not call for the genocide of Jews and the elimination of Israel?
When
you testify that you understand that is the definition of intifada. Is that speech according to the Code of Conduct or not?
We embrace a commitment to free expression and give a wide berth to free expression, even of views that are objectionable.
You and I both know that's not the case. You were aware that Harvard ranked dead last when it came to free speech. Are you not aware of that report?
As I observed earlier, I reject that characterization.
It's the data shows it's true. And isn't it true that Harvard previously rescinded multiple offers of admissions for applicants and accepted freshmen for sharing offensive memes, racist statements, sometimes as young as 16 years old? Did Harvard not rescind those offers of admission?
That long predates my time as president.
But you understand that Harvard made that decision to rescind those offers of admission?
I have no reason to contradict the facts as you present them.
Correct, because it's a fact. You're also aware that a Winthrop House faculty dean was let go over who he chose to legally represent, correct? That was while you were dean.
That is an incorrect characterization of what transpired.
What's the characterization?
I'm not going to get into details about a personnel matter.
Well, let me ask you this. Will admissions offers be rescinded or any disciplinary action be taken against students or applicants who say, "From the river to the sea" or intifada, advocating for the murder of Jews?
As I've said, that type of hateful, reckless, offensive speech is personally abhorrent to me.
Today that no action will be taken. What action will be taken?
When speech crosses into conduct that violates our policies, including policies against bullying, harassment, or intimidation, we take action, and we have robust disciplinary processes that allow us to hold individuals accountable.
What action has been taken against students who are harassing and calling for the genocide of Jews on Harvard's campus?
I can assure you we have robust
What
disciplinary
actions have been
processes
taken? I'm not
with
asking.
actions underway.
I'm asking what actions have been taken against
Given-
those students.
Given students' rights to privacy and our obligations under FERPA, I will not say more about any specific cases other than to reiterate that processes are ongoing.
Do you know what the number one hate crime in America is?
I know that over the last couple of months, there has been an alarming rise of anti-Semitism, which I understand is the critical topic that we are here to discuss.
That's correct. It is anti-Jewish hate crimes. And Harvard ranks the lowest when it comes to protecting Jewish students. This is why I've called for your resignation. And your testimony today, not being able to answer with moral clarity, speaks volumes. I yield back.
Representative, our approach to speech is as I identified. It follows and is guided by the United States Constitution, which allows for robust perspectives. I disagree with the characterization that we treat speech differently.
Now, as of the date of the production of this response, Sunday, December 10th, 2023, it's important to note that the University of Pennsylvania President Liz Magill has already resigned. And I would expect, and quite frankly hope, that the other two would not be much further behind her. So we'll see how that goes. It's interesting to note that even Senator John Fetterman, the Democrat from Pennsylvania who had the stroke and has been the source of much controversy given his condition, had said about Magill's testimony that it was, quote, embarrassing for a venerable Pennsylvania university, end quote. Now, when Senator John Fetterman gets it right and is able to articulate a correct response such as that one, I'd take note. Now, the real question here seems to be, what is the definition of an intifada, and is that a call to violence to exterminate all Jews? Well, the translation of the Arabic word intifada is actually uprising or shaking off. And so the problem that you run into here is political hyperbole. So they're not directly out there chanting, we should exterminate all people of Jewish descent or in the Jewish religion beginning today, right now, let's all go do it. That clearly would cross the threshold. But when you're reciting these statements and slogans and jargon like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is not a direct threat in any way. There are a couple of different categories of speech that could be unprotected or could be limited. And so let's just take a closer look at that for a second. The first one that you have is the incitement rule. Incitement is basically any speech that causes others to undertake the commission of illegal or harmful actions. Now, this has a varied history depending on the political climate at the time throughout the country's history. And so there's always wiggle room here. But basically, in Schenck versus United States, where you had protesters who were trying to get people to ignore the draft, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes applied initially the bad tendency test, which basically says speech that tends to harm the public welfare is not protected speech, but also added to that this represented a clear and present danger. And so that is the test that emerged from Schenck versus United States. And that basically says that there is imminent harm of lawless action in that speech. Okay, so you could move on to RAV, which is just the initials of the young person who was in this case, burning crosses in the city of St. Paul. That was ruled protected speech by the Supreme Court because it was considered to be political hyperbole. And I would say the same standard would apply to this From the River to the Sea. Does everybody know basically what that means and why it was created? Yes, but you don't derive the meaning from a term or expression and then outlaw it based on what the perceived meaning of it is. It has to specifically cross the line into unprotected speech. So in other words, a person who is chanting from the river to the sea could simply say, well, I'm just advocating that people who are in those areas be able to live life unmolested by others, and in no way did I imply. See, the meaning is subject to the individual in that case, and even though we all know what they are screaming about when they say that, the problem is that it's not specific enough to fall into that category of unprotected speech. The next threshold might be true threats. And true threats are those statements where the speaker means to communicate a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular individual or group of individuals. And broadly speaking, the Supreme Court has held that speech does lose its First Amendment protection and becomes intimidation when it is one of these true threats where a speaker directs the threat to a person or a group of people with the intention of placing the victim in fear of bodily harm or death. The last category would be fighting words. This is another category of potentially unprotected speech. Fighting words are those that, by the very act of being spoken, tend to incite the individual to whom they are directed at to respond violently and immediately with no time to contemplate or think things over. Fighting words have to be directed toward a specific person. So it wouldn't, all of the speech that I've heard on these nutty college campuses would not seem to cross any of those thresholds to become fighting words, at least not that I've seen. I'm sure there have been particular instances where that has in fact occurred. I just haven't seen it, or perhaps it hasn't been recorded because most of it that you're seeing is crowd footage and that sort of thing. The true threats, a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence, calling for something like this probably fits into the category of political hyperbole, so it wouldn't be considered a true threat. And again, the incitement threshold I don't believe is met because it's political hyperbole. And so without a specific wording and intention, you don't really have unprotected free speech. There is no First Amendment exception for harassment. Courts have struck down anti-harassment regulations time and time again, generally because of the overbroad language that's used to describe them. But student-on-student harassment, which, now here's the legal definition, consists of unwelcome discriminatory conduct that is, quote, so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, and that so undermines and detracts from the victim's educational experience that the victim's students are effectively denied equal access to an institution's resources and opportunities. In other words, it doesn't become unprotected speech in the form of harassment until it actually interferes with another student's ability to access the resources and opportunities of a particular institution. Do I agree with these three university presidents on principle? Absolutely. What they said about free speech was right on the money. It was unambiguous, and I completely agree with them that while vile speech like that seems to tug at everyone's conscience, as well it should, it clearly did not appear to cross any threshold where it would become unprotected speech according to the First Amendment. However, that's really not what's at issue because they are private institutions. And so these private institutions are more than free to come up with any type of code of student conduct. They can outlaw or limit speech of any kind. And the very idea that these three idiots would go waltzing into Congress and try and convey that they are just fortified bastions of free speech in the country is absolutely absurd. I mean, it was theater of the absurd to watch that, knowing where they are on FIRE's ranking of free speech institutions in the country. And not only that, but these are places where conservative speakers are never invited, or they're disinvited, or they're shouted down. These are the home of microaggressions and safe spaces and demands for compelled speech, like using people's made-up pronouns. So the idea that these are bastions of free speech, the way that they had tried to convey it, is absolutely absurd. However, the questions that they weren't asked, that they were responding to, were technically accurate. And that is to say that the federal government and the First Amendment actually does protect all of the speech, or I would say it does appear to, from what I've seen. And I haven't seen everything, but certainly does appear to protect all of that ugly speech that we had seen. Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and MIT, they're not the government. So they are private institutions. They're not even public institutions. They are private. And so the First Amendment does not govern what they are allowed to do with free speech. Just as in the case of your employer is free to make all kinds of rules regarding speech in the workplace. They can tell you that they don't want politics discussed in the lunchroom. They don't want this or that said or done to whatever group of people. And unless it crosses some federal threshold where you're actually now you're harassing people with your speech, or you're infringing on people's civil rights, then your private employer is free to make any rules that they want. So these are all essentially moot points, because what these university and college presidents were saying was in regard to the First Amendment. And they're correct about that. The federal government would not be able to regulate any of this nonsense as unprotected speech and then, crack down on it in that way. But they're not public institutions, and they're not the federal government. They are private entities. And just like a private employer, they are allowed to enact certain reasonable limits on speech, such as not being able to talk about politics, or not being able to aggress different groups of people with demeaning statements. They're free to come up with all kinds of things like that. So, the idea that any of these institutions are bastions of free speech, the way that these three morons tried to present them as being, is unadulterated nonsense. These universities are the home of microaggressions and safe spaces and the demand for compelled speech, like using certain pronouns, some of them just manufactured recently right on the college campuses themselves. So the idea that they would come into the United States Congress and try to portray themselves as the great guardians of free speech is absolutely laughable. Now, what does this all come down to for me? Well, these statements and these chants and these other vicious things that are being propagated on these university campuses are ideologically compelled actions. In other words, they're calls for actions based on religious blood feud, essentially, and nothing more. Now, someone might say, well, gosh, Mr. M, you could see religious edicts on signs of protesters who are in front of abortion clinics. And that's true. But when you see a sign that says, thou shalt not kill, or they're quoting biblical verses, I've not seen a case where these were not simply ideological repudiations. In other words, they're a call to cease and desist doing something. The difference is that what we're seeing on the university campuses are calls to go and do something. Ideologically compelled actions versus ideological repudiations. And there's a big difference and a distinction to be made there for sure. It's important to remember that whatever you think of the conflict or the people involved in it, the Middle East is an under-civilized part of the world that's comprised of monarchies and theocracies. The primary cause of fighting between Arabs and Jews is an ideologically driven religious blood feud. It's nothing more. It's not the call to, withdraw troops from this certain area or to stop interfering or intervening in the affairs of people who live there. This is a religious blood feud. And I think that probably the majority of these students who are out there screeching and protesting about it have no idea that that's the case. They couldn't speak to it in any way. And they have been trained and conditioned by these universities to simply see this issue in terms of oppressed and oppressor. I mean, this is the Freirean education system in action. That's what they've been trained to do. That's why they see it this way. And ultimately, it doesn't matter that they know nothing about the issue that they're screeching about, because at the end of the day, it's not about that issue. Their protesting and throwing a fit is about advancing the social revolution in this country. That's what it's really about. So they couldn't give a damn about Palestine. They couldn't give a damn about the Jews, about the Arabs. There's probably a very, very small number of passionate people within these groups who genuinely know and can speak to these issues and care about them and are protesting for that reason. The overwhelming majority of these students are doing so because it's simply a means to an end, and that end is advancing the social revolution in the United States, because that's what this is all about. Anyway, that's what I see in these chaotic scenes around America's college campuses and universities. It's important to note that the overwhelming majority of protests, almost certainly those that have become violent or been on the edge of becoming violent, have only been occurring on American college campuses and universities. And you might ask, what a strange thing that all of these students who couldn't seem to have cared any less about this issue a couple months ago are suddenly so invested in it. Why is that? And I would say to you that the reason for that is you are seeing the result of a few decades of Freirean pedagogy and education manifesting itself in the university students today. And that is to say, of course they don't know anything about the context of this issue. Of course they don't genuinely care about Palestinian people or Jewish people or even know enough about it to speak to it. It doesn't matter to them because that's not what it's about. Their actions are about advancing the social revolution that's unfolding in front of us in the United States and nothing more. That's what this is all about. I hope that you found this video helpful. If you have comments about it, please feel free to leave those and I will do my best to respond to those. And I thank you very much for your time.